Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Linda Caprera, and I'm the interim president and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of the Chamber, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, What is Maine Without Lobster? I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors of today's event. Our 2023 series sponsors are AARP, Central Maine Power, Delta Dental, First Light, Kennebec Savings Bank, and Sun Life. And I just want to talk a little bit about just a few administrative notes for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded for future viewing. The recording will be made available on our website at the Chamber and YouTube channel within a day or so. You've all joined the Zoom session muted in an effort to reduce the background noise. If you become disconnected from the session, please reconnect using the same link. We welcome your participation, and if you have questions for our panelists, please use the chat function in the Zoom at any time during the presentation, and we will try to address the questions. If for some reason you wish to be anonymous with your question, please send a private chat message to me, Linda Caprera, and I'll be happy to relay your question anonymously to the panel. And we will address all questions as time permits. So on Monday, September 25th, we celebrated National Lobster Day. In fact, this entire week is designated as Maine Lobster Week. I can't think of a better time for us to share this presentation with all of you. Our state's heritage and identity has been defined by Maine's lobster industry. It's an industry which many Mainers toil in difficult and dangerous conditions to produce a delicacy that reaches tables all around the globe. Today, we're going to explore the past, present, and future challenges that face the lobster industry. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panels of experts. Our first panelist is Marianne LaCroix. She is the Executive Director of the Maine Lobster Marketing Collaborative. It's an organization that promotes Maine lobster to markets worldwide and is funded by lobstermen, dealers, and processors in Maine. She has been with the collaborative since 2006 and its director since 2019. Prior to joining the collaborative, Marianne worked in advertising agencies in Boston and Maine, primarily marketing seafood brands, including Norwegian seafood and Chilean salmon. Kurt Brown is our next speaker. Kurt is a lobsterman from Cape Elizabeth and a marine biologist at Ready Seafood in Saco. He spent 9 years as part of the Gulf of Maine Research Institute research team. He has an MS in marine biology and earned an MS in marine policy from UMaine in 2007. He earned his BA in history and a BS in biology from Union College in 2002. And our last panelist is Patrice McCarran. Patrice is policy director of Maine's Lobstermen Association, the oldest and largest commercial fishing organization on the East Coast, working proactively on issues that affect the lobster industry through state, regional, and federal management processes. Patrice is respected as a major resource for the lobster industry and the challenges it faces. So let's begin our panel discussion, learning more about the Lobster Week and why it's important not only to recognize our hardworking lobstermen families, but also acknowledge the industry's centuries-old sustainability traditions and, of course, encourage people to eat Maine lobster. Marianne, let's start with you. We've heard a lot lately about the lawsuit over proposed federal regulations intended to protect the endangered right whales. Recently, a federal appeals court ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Maine Lobstermen's Association. Can you talk a little bit more about MLA's victory and what it means for lobstermen moving forward?
Patrice, should I start?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Linda. We're really happy to be here today. And as you mentioned, it is Maine Lobster Week, which we're really excited about. This is one of the programs that the collaborative puts together to help draw attention to Maine lobster during the fall season, which is when the fishermen are still out there going strong. We're catching a lot of product. So it's a great time. We have over 50 restaurants participating this year. If you go to the website, mainelobsterweek.com, you'll see a list of them as well as the menu that they're offering. Some restaurants are doing a 3-course lobster menu. Some are doing an individual dish, but it's a great week to get out there and hit one of these restaurants and enjoy a lobster dish. And then one of the other things that you mentioned are the people that are actually bringing us lobster. And that's something that the collaborative has also been focusing on this year. And we've been highlighting different people in the industry, both on and off the water, that work hard every day to bring a great product to people's plates. So that's something you can see on our website, lobsterfrommaine.com, and read some of the different profiles and see some of the photos. And we've got some really great stories within the industry. But before we get started today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the industry. People live here in Maine, so you know that lobster and Maine are synonymous, but it's a really critical industry to the state. It's a heritage industry. It's one that's been one of the oldest commercial fisheries in the country. Kurt will talk a little bit later about the sustainability measures that have been in place for over 150 years that have kept the fishery robust for all that time. It's something that's critical to our island and coastal communities as well. We have about 5,000 fishermen, lobster fishermen in the state of Maine. They range in age from 8. That's the earliest that you can get a commercial fishing license. And we have 8-year-olds with their own boat going out and fishing. And we also have people that are over 100 years old that are still going out on the water and fishing. So it's a very, very diverse fleet. We have, big age range. We have different boat sizes. Some people stay near shore. We have people going 20 to 30 miles offshore to catch lobster. Here in Maine, we also have what's called an owner-operator rule, and this is very important because it means that the person who has the lobster license has to own his boat and traps and actually be on the boat for it to fish. And this means that everybody out on the water is an independent businessman. This is very important because you can't have a corporation that buys up lobster licenses or boats and hires captains and sends them out to fish. So that means that everybody out on the water has a stake in the fishery. This is their own business that they're managing. And it's been very important. It's one of the reasons that the fishery is so successful today. So a little bit by the numbers, last year we caught just under 100 million pounds of lobster. It was valued at about $390 million at the dock. In addition to those working on the water, I said there were 5,000 or so fishermen. Most of the fishermen have 1 or 2 other people on the boat with them. There's also another 4,000 jobs on the shore side. These are the people that are working on the wharf, working at the live lobster dealers at the processing facilities. And overall, the fishery contributes about $1.4 billion to the state's economy. That's not even considering what we're doing on the tourism side. We haven't really figured out how to calculate that, but we know tourists come to Maine. They want to see the working waterfront. They want to eat Maine lobster. It's a big component in our restaurants. So that's sort of an unmeasured benefit to the state. But just wanted to set the stage a little bit about the fishery, and I'll turn it over to Patrice to talk a little bit more about what's going on with the lawsuits.
Thanks, Marianne. Great cue up. I would say the short answer in direct response to the question about what does the appeals court mean, the short answer is the Maine lobster fishery remains open for business. We were facing a situation where we really thought that as 2024 rolled in, we would be losing much of the smaller end of our fleet. Our fleet is very diverse, as Marianne said. A lot of our small and medium boats were not going to make it. But it's not as simple as just the appeals court win. It literally took an act of Congress plus the appeals court win to keep this fishery open for business. The court side that the MLA is in charge of is part of a longer term strategy to ensure that the federal government continues to follow the laws as Congress intended. But in the short term, it truly was the act of Congress that kept our boats on the water. The MLA, I just want to say we're incredibly grateful. I want to acknowledge the Maine delegation, the leadership of Senator Collins, Senator King. They worked truly to pass a historic piece of legislation. We called it the December miracle at the time. It came through in December of 2022. And Congress deemed our fishery in compliance with both the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act through the year 2028. And as if that wasn't enough, they actually provided a whole lot of money to collect the data that we need to put effective conservation measures in place for right whales that will allow the fishery to keep going. So how on earth did we get to a place where we needed an act of Congress and mounting a massive legal strategy to keep our fishery open? In 2021, we learned that the federal government had set a conservation plan for right whales that at its core would require the lobster fishery to reduce its risk by 98% in less than 10 years. The MLA has been involved in the whale issue for decades. We know that there are 0 right whale deaths ever attributed to our fishery, and we knew that a 98% risk reduction would mean the end of the fishery here in Maine. So we took a very, very unusual action for us. We mounted a legal strategy. We pulled together an amazing legal team, and we sued the federal government in 2021. And truly a David and Goliath issue. We had an office of 2.5 people and managed to sue the federal government. So we knew that the government was using imperfect data. We had tried to work with the government for years to get them to look at this issue more reasonably to keep the fishery going, and they wouldn't do it. They admitted that they consistently use the most pessimistic data points that they can, and they justify that by saying, this is what the right whales need, this is what the law requires. We knew that that wasn't the case. We argued that the law requires the government to use the best available data. The government's required to look at things that are reasonably certain to occur. So you don't run through your model a scenario that the lobster industry is actually not capable of replicating. And that's what the government did. They used the most pessimistic data at every point of the way. So fortunately for us, the appeals court did unanimously rule that the government abused its discretion. As one judge stated during the trial, the government not only put their thumb on the scale of the right whale, they actually put their entire arm on the scale of the right whale. And in doing so, we're going to wipe out the Maine lobster fishery. The appeals court took significant issue with the government's conclusion that the lobster fishery kills at least 46 whales over a decade. And they point out that that was a staggering departure from the data that shows all U.S. fisheries combined had only led to the death of 2 right whales over the last 10 years. So truly a significant win. And I guess just to sort of sum up, what does it actually mean? What does this court decision mean? As our attorney said in a recent article, it just means that the agency now needs to call balls and strikes fairly. And that's all that the lobster fishery ever asked to do. We want to do our best to protect right whales. As Kurt's going to talk about, we've done a ton to protect right whales. We want to continue to do that, but we want to be judged fairly and do a risk reduction plan that's going to work for the whales and allow our fishery to continue to operate. So.
All right, good. Patrice, I think this is a question for you. Maine's lobster industry is well known for sustaining its fishery through self-regulation and innovation. What industry innovations are in store that will aid the protection of the right whale population?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the Maine lobster fishery is world renowned, as Marianne said, as one of the most sustainable fisheries. And I could bore you to death with everything that we're doing and have done. But I think as Kurt, as a person who is running a lobster boat on the water, I think he will be able to convey that information even better than I can.
Okay, so we'll start with Kurt then. Can you answer that?
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me, and thanks for everybody joining.
Welcome.
And it's a really great opportunity for us to explain what's going on currently, but what we've been going through for the past almost 20 plus years at this point in time as an industry. This time yesterday, I was actually out on my boat off the coast of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, hauling traps. And myself and the 5,000 other lobster harvesters, if we were ever asked what we're most proud of kind of being a part of this industry, I bet the answer you would hear most is we're proud of the way we can serve not only Maine's lobster resource, but the Gulf of Maine ecosystem as a whole. For generations, the rules that have been in place to protect Maine's lobster resource are common sense rules that effectively protect the lobsters out in the ocean. So simple rules like the only way you can legally harvest a lobster is with a trap here in Maine. Everything that comes up gets measured. If a lobster is too small, it goes back into the ocean. Our minimum size is set at a size where lobsters have the ability to reproduce at least once or twice before they reach that minimum size. Additionally, if we catch a lobster that's too big, over 5 inches carapace length, which is the equivalent of about 4 or 5 pounds, those lobsters have to go back into the ocean. We usually just, take a selfie with one and then throw it back into the ocean because they're so amazing. And there's a lot of them out there for this reason. And the reason we throw those larger lobsters back is because they're the breeders. So a 1 pound female lobster can hold on the order of about 10,000 eggs and release those every year, whereas a larger 4, 5, 6, 7 pound lobster can hold over 100,000 eggs. And those egg studies have shown that they're of higher quality and survive at higher rates. If we catch an egg-bearing female, obviously we have to throw her back into the ocean. But before we do, we're required to cut a notch into one of the tail flippers. That notch signifies that she is a proven breeder. So even if she's caught again without eggs, she is illegal to keep. There is no quota. We can catch as many lobsters as we can with the maximum number of traps that we have. The maximum number of traps varies by zone, but generally along the coast, the maximum number of traps any individual harvester can have is 800. And it's those common sense rules that protect the juveniles, protect the brood stock, that keep our population healthy and sustainable. In addition to protecting lobsters as an industry, we do a very, very good job of protecting the ocean ecosystem. And that includes right whales. That includes the majestic, endangered right whale. And so often this issue gets framed in the media, as I'm sure most of you are aware, as an issue where it's lobstermen versus right whales. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. I would argue that if there is an industry that has done more to protect right whales over the years than Maine's lobster fishery, it would be news to me. I truly think our industry has done more to protect right whales than any fishery up and down the East Coast. So what does that mean? Ultimately, here I am sitting in Cape Elizabeth. And when I was a senior in high school at Cape Elizabeth High School, circa 1998, I remember in the spring of that year spending my last $100 over at Hamilton Marine, which used to be on 4th Street in Portland, and buying whale-safe gear so I could go lobstering that summer. In the intervening 20 plus years, our industry has done everything from putting weak links into our end lines designed to break away under strain, under much less strain than will be equivalently put out by a right whale. And 2 years ago, putting new and different weak links into our end lines. We have removed all the floating rope from our fishery, which poses more of a risk than sinking rope. So we've replaced float rope with sinking rope. We've reduced the number of end lines in the water, and in the process, removed over 30,000 miles of rope from the Gulf of Maine. We've closed over or right around 1,000 square miles of the Gulf of Maine at very productive, lucrative times of year to fishing to protect right whales. We mark all of our gear. We mark all of our end lines to identify that that gear is fished in Maine water for the specific reason that in the rare event of an entanglement, we want to know where that entanglement occurred. So we mark all of our end lines, and we were actually proactive as a state and met those marking requirements ahead of federal requirements. All of this required a lot of effort on the part of industry, both time, effort, money. I think if you multiply the conservative $20,000 that I know I've spent on, at least on, rigging over to be whale safe, you multiply that by 5,000 and you get a total that's just mind-boggling, like $100 million that our industry has spent protecting right whales. And all this effort, all this money would mean nothing ultimately if what we were doing isn't working or wasn't working. But I think the effectiveness of what we do as an industry can be summed up very simply by two numbers that I'm sure you've all heard at this point in time. And I sound kind of like a broken record saying it, but it really speaks to the fact that the effort that we put in as an industry has truly worked. Two numbers that really sum this up are 0 and 0. So 0 documented entanglements of a right whale in Maine lobster gear since 2004, and 0 documented mortalities of a right whale in Maine lobster gear ever. Those are powerful numbers right there. and speaks to the effectiveness of our industry protecting right whales. Despite this, a year ago, as Patrice mentioned, our industry was looking at a cliff. There was a very real possibility that by 2024, our industry would be effectively regulated out of business. If you were to go back a year ago right now and look at Uncle Henry's or look on Facebook Marketplace, there were more boats for sale, lobster boats for sale, than I have ever seen. There were more traps for sale than I have ever seen. I had friends who had just purchased brand new lobster boats and looked to make a future here in Maine as part of this industry who were considering selling out entirely. There was a level of fear along the coast that I had never, ever seen before. And it was truly scary when you think about it from an individual harvester perspective, from a large business perspective, from a coastal community perspective, from a Maine tax base perspective. We were very, very afraid as an industry, and rightly so, because what was looming on the horizon was there were some very, very dark clouds. As Patrice mentioned, our federal delegation, our governor, worked tirelessly to get an amendment into the federal spending bill that put off any new regulations related to right whales for 6 years. And I know how some in the audience could hear that and think, well, that's just industry pushing back against regulation. That was our industry fighting for our lives at that point in time. And this is what the last year has been for our industry, has literally been fighting for our lives. So we were able to get an amendment into the federal spending bill, which not only put a pause on any new regulations for 6 years, but also, like Patrice mentioned, funded to the tune of about $50 million in very necessary monitoring and science work to learn A, where right whales are, and B, where they aren't. Because in my 30 plus years of lobstering in the Gulf of Maine, I can truly say I have never seen a right whale, and the majority of harvesters up and down the coast would say the same thing. And then Patrice also talked about just heroic work that MLA's legal team did in suing the federal government. I mean, you want to talk about, like she said, a David and Goliath scenario. Little Maine Lobstermen's Association suing the federal government in federal court. And it isn't very often that the federal agencies will lose when a case goes to federal court. And in this case, back in June, I remember getting a news alert, opening up my phone and reading this and texting Patrice and saying, is this real? Because for so long, in so many court cases and so many biological opinions, where the feds were using worst case scenarios in every single parameter of the models that they were using to assess risk to our fishery, we had just gotten pummeled, and we continued to lose and lose and lose. So when this came through, and we read something like the court added that the National Marine Fisheries Service biological opinion was capricious and contrary to law. And then they went on to say, this is the 3-judge panel that we won in this case unanimously. They wrote, the service's legal reasoning was not just wrong, it was egregiously wrong. I mean, that's a haymaker coming from a federal court to a federal agency. But what it spoke to was what we had been shouting from the rooftop for 20 plus years. We're not the problem. We're the ones trying to protect the right whales, and we're doing so effectively. And then lastly, I will end on this, but Patrice mentioned it as well. The court noted that the lack of data led National Marine Fisheries Service to conclude the lobster and Jonah crab federal fisheries kill 46 whale deaths per decade. That's what their models were telling us. When in reality, this was a, quote, staggering departure from the 2 documented deaths known to have originated in all U.S. fisheries over a period of 9 years. And neither of those deaths were associated with Maine's lobster fishery. So you can see why we were shouting from the rooftops and basically fighting for our lives against what we thought was unfair treatment, and it certainly was. And where we are right now is certainly much better off than where we were a year ago. But this fight is by no means over. And it's all thanks to the hard work that Patrice and her organization put in, Marianne and her organization, our federal delegation. My gosh, I mean, I think December was a month to remember for the entire federal delegation and their staff. And it's just been, well, I'll leave it at the fact that it's been quite a year.
Yeah. Well, I just want to applaud the whole industry for really, taking that proactive approach to protecting the whales. I think that's responsible, and I think it's very admirable. So I just want to comment on that.
Thank you.
Kurt, another question for you. Scientists have said that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than many of the global oceans. Is this a concern for the industry, and what are the challenges for the industry in the face of climate change?
It's a great question. And the short answer is yes, the Gulf of Maine is warming. And that's something as an industry we have to keep our eye on. We have to keep our finger on the pulse of what is going on in the Gulf of Maine. And that's where monitoring programs supported by the state are so important. We do a very good job as an industry monitoring all life stages of the lobster life cycle so that we know well in advance of harvest how that population is doing. It takes a lobster 5 to 8 years to reach legal size. So we have monitoring programs going on everywhere from like a 1-month-old lobster to juveniles to subadults to adults. And as a state and as an industry, we do a very good job monitoring that. The headline that a lot of people are most familiar with beside the whale issue is probably the headline saying that lobsters are moving north and moving out of the Gulf of Maine. I'm not going to sit here and deny climate change by any means. I've been around the world. I've studied coral reefs. I've seen the negative impacts that climate change can have on marine ecosystems. But the fact of the matter is here in the Gulf of Maine, we're really in the sweet spot for lobster thermal preference. And that isn't going to change even under worst case scenarios for quite a while. I mean, if you go on nearacoust.org this morning and look at the buoy data, which monitors temperature throughout the Gulf of Maine at 150 feet of water in eastern Maine this morning, it is 53 degrees. Wow. In western Maine, it is 51 degrees. So it's actually colder right now in western Maine than it is in eastern Maine. And that's never told as part of the story of lobsters moving out of the Gulf of Maine. At depth, western Maine, because of stratification, has colder bottom temperatures than eastern Maine. So that whole lobsters moving out of the Gulf of Maine story just doesn't really jive with what's happening in reality. And the reason that story gained a lot of traction was because there was a study out of Rutgers University probably 5 or 6 years ago, which a computer model lab mined National Marine Fisheries Service trawl survey data. That's a survey that goes up and down the East Coast. Wonderful way to sample fish. They drag a net along the bottom. Great way to catch fish. Terrible way to sample lobsters. So they took that data, which is a reputable data set, and they said, all right, 30 years ago, the center of the lobster population seems to be off the coast of Long Island. And not Long Island, Maine, Long Island, New York. And now, according to that data, the center of the lobster population is somewhere in the Gulf of Maine. So first of all, I was a terrible statistics student, but one test I'm pretty good at is the straight face test. If you're telling me 30 years ago, the center of the lobster population was off the coast of Long Island, New York, that just doesn't pass the straight face test. That trawl survey doesn't really come near the coast of Maine. It doesn't do well in Rocky Bottom, which we all know the coast of Maine is full of ledges and rocks and bottom that's not suitable to trawling. So ultimately, that narrative was driven by that story saying 30 years ago, the center of the population was off Long Island, New York. It is now in the Gulf of Maine, and with climate change, it's just going to continue to accelerate north. Inherently flawed study, unfortunately, drove that narrative, and that narrative we've been combating as an industry for years and years and years. There isn't a week that goes by where I'm sitting at Ready Seafood as the marine biologist where one of our customers calls and says, hey, are you going to have lobsters in another 5 years? And it's just very, very frustrating from an industry perspective to have to explain what's going on with that narrative. It's a catchy headline, it drives clicks, it sells papers, but ultimately there isn't a lot behind it. That being said, the Gulf of Maine, there's no doubt that it is warming, and that's why, as an industry, like I said, as a state, we do a good job monitoring our lobster resource. Ready Seafood, which is the company I work for, we're the actual only private company that funds public lobster research. We work on a collaboration with the University of Maine, where we set out cages full of rocks every June. Those rocks are the suitable habitat for those baby, tiny 1-month-old lobsters. We haul them back in October. So in another couple of weeks, we'll be going out with the UMaine team, hauling those cages up, going through all the rocks, measuring all the baby lobsters to give us a good indicator of how that young of the year population is doing. So I started with a short answer and then went into a very long-winded, way too detailed answer. But generally, I'm not concerned about populations of lobster in the Gulf of Maine, for decades and decades. It's a wild-caught fishery. There will be ups and landings. There will be downs and landings. But overall, we have a healthy resource that we do a good job taking care of.
Oh, good. Good.
And Linda, if I could just add on the climate change issue, it's actually a very significant issue when it comes to right whale conservation. They did notice a pretty significant oceanographic shift in 2010 as the temperatures started warming, and that impacted where right whales are spending their time. And so we're now seeing large aggregations of whales that used to be sort of in the Bay of Fundy, kind of at the tip of eastern Maine, are now all the way around Nova Scotia, and they're in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they're spending a lot of time feeding up there. So whales have actually, because of climate change, shifted further and further away from where the Maine lobster fishery takes place. But the science is still using some older data sets and really looking to regulate the Maine lobster fishery when our what they call co-occurrence has gone way down. So it really complicates getting an effective right whale management plan in place. The species is transboundary. They've always been in the US and in Canada. But as more of the whales are spending time in Canada, we have a much more stringent legal system here. And if whales die in Canada, the US fisheries, the US shipping industry are actually responsible for taking care of the risk of whales that are dying in another country. So, one of the things that we're working on is to really get the federal government to wrap their hands around some of the climate science so that they can take that into account and make sure that the risks that they're asking US businesses to address are actually risks that are occurring here in our own country.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely important. I totally agree. I mean, this is all good information, I think, that, folks need to hear. It's really good information. I'm going to throw this question out there. In the global economy, what are the biggest competitive threats to the industry?
Yeah, I can take this one. We've been talking obviously a lot about the threats that are occurring within the industry itself on the water. But then, we look at the sales side. We're obviously operating in a global market. Maine lobster is distributed to over 50 countries, as well as obviously throughout the US. So it's a worldwide product. Canada is our biggest trading partner, which is a kind of interesting situation. We call them kind of frenemies. Their season is basically the opposite of ours. So while the Maine fishery operates year round, we catch the majority of our lobsters in the summer and fall. And Canada has different open and closed fisheries, but they're catching the majority of their lobsters in the winter and spring. So companies that are purchasing lobster generally purchase from both countries in order to have a year-round supply that they can offer to their customers. So we tend to be each other's biggest customers when we're selling back and forth. This creates some challenges because obviously buyers, particularly overseas buyers, the exports, they have choices whether they purchase a US product or a Canadian product. And we're impacted by things that, impact any export. So the product, even things like exchange rates. So, if the dollar changes, the product can suddenly become more expensive to our customer in another country. Trade tariffs have been a big issue over the past few years. The US product might be hit with a trade tariff that the product isn't. So suddenly it's a more expensive product. So those are just general considerations as our companies are looking where to sell the product that they have to deal with, because it's expensive to sell to foreign markets. We can spend a lot of money opening up a foreign market and suddenly not be competitive in that market overnight through market forces that we have no control over. So from a marketing consideration, my organization focuses primarily on the US market, just because it is a very safe and growing market for us.
All right, good.
Well, I was going to say, over the past few years too, we've been obviously facing COVID shutdowns. So as those were sweeping around through different countries, suddenly China might be shut down and would have to be looking for different markets to sell the product that weren't facing such difficult situations. And we're obviously also dealing with things here at home in the US. We have 2021 was the best year ever for Maine lobster. People were coming out of COVID shutdowns. Everyone wanted to celebrate. They had a lot of extra money. We're a celebratory product. So it was a great year all around. On the highest boat price the fishermen have ever received.
Wow, that's
for
great.
an annual basis.
Yeah.
But then last year, people are tight in 2022, people were tightening their belts. They're worried about inflation. Things are getting more expensive. And so, it was a little bit more difficult year, and we're all facing what everyone else is facing: high gas prices. The cost of doing business is higher. It's more expensive to hire staff. So that's difficult. And going back to something Patrice and Kurt were talking about with the right whales. Last year, directly as a result of those lawsuits, the Maine lobster fishery lost 2 important sustainability certifications. And that's been very difficult. We've been working along with the dealers and suppliers to educate customers about what we are doing to protect right whales. But because of technicalities, we don't have those certifications available to us. So that makes it a challenge for companies that want to just be able to tick a box and say they have a certification without really gaining a full understanding of. It's a lot more work to really learn what a fishery is doing and make an independent assessment as a company. So a lot of them are looking for those assessments. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing.
And I'll just add real quickly to that last point. I mean, so much of my last year has been working with our customers around the country on what Marianne just spoke about, with those sustainability certifications being lost. Ultimately, a lot of retailers and a lot of buyers around the country want that box checked because it makes their life easier. But what I'm very proud of is the partners that we work with and sell our lobsters to around the country and around the world. Realistically, we're very open to hearing our side of the story. So much of my time was spent traveling to customers around the country, explaining to their teams everything I just spoke about when it came to whales, what we've been doing, why it's successful. And I'm very proud to say that, as a company, we didn't lose a single customer. And as an industry, there may have only been 1 or 2, I think, tops, large retailers that didn't continue selling Maine lobster. So we've worked very hard as an industry, and Marianne's group has done an amazing job helping us maintain markets, which is so key, because we have a hyper locally harvested product that then enters a global market, and those challenges are changing every year. And that was a big one for sure.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw out another question to any one of you that want to answer. You spoke earlier about the appeals court victory, but there's another lawsuit against Monterey Bay Aquarium over their red listing of lobsters. Can you update us on that lawsuit and what it means for the industry? I'll just throw that out there.
Sure, I can take that one. Maine Lobstermen's Association is one of the plaintiffs in that case against the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So we initially went to the aquarium because they had red listed the lobster. They did not do an independent scientific review. They simply looked at the poor science that the federal government was using and said, hey, we're just going to stick you guys in the red box. And they actually launched a national media campaign around that to really drive the point home, to really try to dissuade our customers from continuing to purchase our product. So we went to them initially and said, hey, you don't have the science right. We had actually worked with them through the entire assessment process to try to avoid red listing. And we asked them one more time, can you take us off the red list? It doesn't make sense. The science do not support this. And they said no. So we sued them for defamation, for smearing the Maine lobster brand, for basing their certification on science that didn't support their conclusion. They in turn filed a motion to dismiss the case, saying that our court case didn't have standing. All of it's now been briefed, so it now goes to the court for reviewing of the briefs. The court will ultimately rule on whether or not the case will stand. And if the case moves forward, it would then go through the discovery phase, and then the case would ultimately be resolved. So at this point, we're expecting to hear from the courts probably in late October or early November. We fully expect that the court will find that the case has standing, because it does have standing. The DC Court of Appeals ruled that, we were in fact correct, that the federal government was abusing the science. So we're very optimistic that the case will move forward, but disappointed that the aquarium was immovable and not willing to work with us. We put a lot of hours into really trying to extend that olive branch and avoid being in this situation in the first place.
Yeah, understandable. Another question. What were the proposed regs that could have ended the industry in Maine? What is the possibility they'll come back in 6 years? I have that question.
I can begin that. We had only gotten to the point of looking at what it would take to get us to a 90% risk reduction, not fully to a 98% risk reduction. And in the easternmost part of the state, Zone A, basically all of Washington and part of Hancock County, we were looking at a full closure of that fishery to the beach for 3 months, state and federal waters. During the summer months, the only months that our students and our seniors can even be on the water at all. We were looking at an extension of the 1,000-mile closure in our lucrative winter months offshore that was going to come further into the coast. And they were going to add an additional month onto that. We were looking at another closure in southern Maine off of an important fishing ground called Jeffrey's Ledge. Again, that was going to be open during very lucrative winter months. Maine alone was looking at a 400 trap reduction, so half of our traps going to the banks, and then losing one of the pieces of rope that we have to fish those lines, which means the likelihood of us actually getting those traps back were really low. So half the traps, half the rope, and then the rope that we had remaining was going to have to be even weaker than it is now. So it was a very, very dicey situation. And the thing that's crazy about this, and takes me right back to this court case that we have, they proposed to close the easternmost part of our state for 3 months. And I can tell you the model had 0.02 right whales in it. I'm not really sure what that means, what a 0.02 of a whale is, but it's not very much. And so we went to them and we said, this makes no sense. Your model has no actual whales in the waters that you're closing. Like, what are we actually going to save? And they said, well, because whales are so rare in Maine, we don't have good data on whales. So since we're not looking, we looked at habitat features, and the habitat could be good for whales. So our model says that could be risky. And ironically, the area directly adjacent to us in Canada would remain open. And part of that area is shared. The US and Canada share jurisdiction. We both claim sovereignty of those waters. And we asked directly, well, can those guys fish? Because the Canadians will be there. And they just said, what the Canadians do in terms of the modeling is irrelevant, and it wouldn't impact our risk. So the short answer was, they can fish there and you can't, and that's what we need to save whales. So it's very disturbing when you have okay science, but then the government uses it a way that doesn't do anything really to affect the whales, but does a lot to really harm the industry.
No, I understand.
I think you can get a good sense of why we've all aged about 20 years in the past 9 to 12 months. I mean, Patrice speaks to it very calmly and very coolly, but you get a sense of the insanity that we were up against.
Oh, sure.
Whales could be there. Therefore, we are going to close the eastern third of the state, which is the most heavily reliant on lobster. Those communities do not exist without the lobster fishery. And they were going to be closed for 3 very lucrative months. And just one quick thing to point out, the lobster fishery is hyper local. It's not like a lot of other fisheries where you can just untie your boat and go to a different part of the state and start fishing over there. You fish where you grew up. I fish off Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Scarborough's the next town over for me. I couldn't name more than 2 harvesters in the town of Scarborough. That's how local this fishery is. So when you close an area, you're shutting that area down. You're not giving people any options to go somewhere else and do something else. I mean, it's just the nature of the fishery is that hyper local aspect to it. And so, yeah, that was very, very daunting.
All right.
Yeah, and I will add, just moving forward, you know, we do have this reprieve until 2028. Thank God for that. And we do have a lot of money coming through to improve the data that we have. So between the court telling the National Marine Fisheries Service that they do need to follow the law and they need to look at situations for the Maine lobster fishery that are like actually within the realm of possibility of happening, that's going to help a lot. I think the data is going to help a lot. It's going to take away a lot of the gray area where the federal government was just filling in with really poor assumptions. But in the end, the federal law is still very, very stringent, and we're still up against a coupling of the Endangered Species Act with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It doesn't really happen anywhere else other than when you're protecting marine mammals. And the standard that the fishery needs to meet under US law is still going to be extremely, extremely difficult to get through. So, you know, how difficult? I'm hoping that between the court case and the new data, the goalpost comes down to a point where the Maine lobster fishery will likely be doing more because the law demands so much, and hope that that can be done in a way that we're not going to lose the fishery. But I would have to say at this point, that's an open question. We still need to see what the data say. We're still working very, very closely with Congress and exploring, you know, potentially there's a need to look at further congressional action because the fishery is not out of the woods yet.
Okay, I got a couple more questions. The first one is there anything else that you folks would like to discuss or think that we should know about the lobster industry that we may not know? Anything at all you want to throw out there?
Oh gosh, there's a long list. But I think it's just ultimately here in Maine, we have a fishery that everyone in our state, you know, should be proud of. And I think that's something that everybody who's involved in the industry takes a lot of pride in. You have a hyper local fishery, you have a sustainable fishery that then satisfies markets around the world. I mean, there are lobsters traveling today from the coast of Maine that were harvested probably 3 days ago and are now on planes everywhere from Paris and Madrid and Rome to Shanghai and Guangzhou. It's a really amazing item that's used for celebrations around the world and harvested sustainably right here off the coast of Maine. It's truly a unique fishery and one we should be proud of.
And I guess the last question I will ask, hold on here. We started this conversation asking, what is Maine without lobster? I'm going to ask each one of you, in your personal opinion, what would Maine be without a vibrant lobster industry? And I'll start with you, Marianne.
Well, we've all talked a little bit about our island and coastal communities, and as Kurt pointed out, this fishery supports island and coastal communities, especially in mid-coast and down East Maine. There are no other options. So that would turn these areas into summer communities. They would not be able to support a year-round population. And these are people that, many of these people have been fishing for 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. This is what their family has done. They've passed this on to their children. Sons and daughters have done it. And it's unthinkable to imagine these communities being turned into seasonal communities that don't support a year-round population. And that's really what we're looking at. And even in southern Maine, where there are other opportunities for the fishermen themselves, they've chosen this as a way of life. This is something they're expert at. They're out on the water every day. They're stewards of the environment. And losing that is, they can't just it's not comparable to go take a job in a factory or retrain to be something else. This is, a part of their identity. So it's really difficult to think about.
Patrice?
Yeah, I agree with everything Marianne said. I've said this before about the lobster fishery. The fishery itself, it has a soul. It is just sort of, it's a force unto itself. And when I'm doing my job, when I'm wrangling with the federal government and lawyers and things that I never, ever thought I would have to do for part of my job, I think of the phone calls that I get with fishermen who are those multi-generational fishermen who have children and grandchildren who call up literally fighting back tears to relay a conversation. Patrice, today my grandson asked me, why you're so upset, Papa? And he said, because you're not going to be able to fish. And there's not even a good reason why you can't fish. There are no whales. This kid's going to fish right on the beach and shore. And it's, for me, those conversations when it's one thing to say it's our tradition, it's our heritage, it's our livelihood, it's the backbone of our coastal economy. That's all true. But when you experience the angst and the fear, the anxiety that Kurt talked about, that we all experienced over the last year, it's just this palpable being. And it's something that I know as long as I'm with the Maine Lobstermen's Association, we have to fight to save this because it is truly the identity of the state of Maine. And these people they'll just cease to function without it. So it's almost too hard to put into words.
Right. I agree. Kurt?
I think two words that come to mind, Maine without lobster, would be unrecognizable, and it would be devastating. I started lobstering when I was 8 years old. I can assure you that as a kid growing up on the coast of Maine, there's nothing more magical than going out on the water and seeing traps come up and full of lobsters and crabs and all these other amazing critters. And it's an amazing experience that's unique to Maine, and thousands of kids get to experience this and be a part of this industry. And we were just cleaning out one of the rooms in the house today, and I found I don't know, this was probably one of the ones that I didn't go swimming with, so it's still in good condition, but like a lobster license from 1997 when I was a kid.
Wow.
Back when I weighed 150 pounds. Work on that. But ultimately, I think one of the most amazing parts of the last 2 summers is being able to bring my 8-year-old and 6-year-old out on the boat with me and share that experience with them. And that's something that is unique to Maine. And if we were to lose that, it would impact not only, my family and my wife and kids, but it would impact families up and down the coast. It would impact communities up and down the coast. So many of these communities rely 100% on the lobster fishery. Without the fishery, they would be like the mill towns of northern Maine. They disappear and they don't come back in any recognizable form.
Yeah.
And we can speak to the tax base aspect of it. Without a lobster fishery, so many of these communities don't have a tax base anymore. And that's the economic argument. But the reason for me why it would make so much of a difference and be so devastating would just be losing the cultural fabric of what Maine really is. People don't come here to eat chicken. They come here for lobsters, what our state is known for. And without it, it would just be unrecognizable.
Yeah, I think all three of you really have illustrated how special and how important this industry is to the state of Maine. And I couldn't imagine, Maine without the lobster industry. I really can't. But anyways, I'd like to thank all of you for joining. I'd like to thank you to our panel of experts, Marianne, Kurt, Patrice, for being with us today. And before we end, I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors again. Our series sponsors are AARP, Central Maine Power, Delta Dental, First Light, Kennebec Savings Bank, and Sun Life. And that concludes today's event. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining.